Over the past decade, China's hunger for Africa's rich natural resources has seen it overtake the EU and America as the continent's largest trading partner. The West, for so long the dominant external force in Africa's affairs, has seen its economic and political interests threatened and now worries about the strategic consequences. But what do these changing dynamics mean on the ground for Africans? In the first of a special two-part report for People and Power, Sorious SAMURA went to find out.
Kole kwaiser beno nikibwone chumbek ko ingebitu kekere kikomei kimi timwek emoni makinyoru akot echek timwecho kikitar keken biik kelenji kinyokeminwo ketik kumbe ko kikikene biik keyae biashara keibu notik cheyobu ano akobo shauritab nusuni kikotar biik nusu ko chumbek nikibwa sikonyokowal ko ngobwa koitu chumibani kosibi soturini kobochu kobendi en kandoik kikikiib emoni ko chebo rabisiek age tugul kotuchin konye.
There is an old African saying, when two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. For many of us Africans, our relationship with the West has defined centuries of bitter and humiliating history. Slavery, colonialism. Since independence, our governments have reduced themselves to begging from the very powers that once enslaved us. Foreign aid, our daily bread, the hopeless continent. Today, a new elephant has arrived in our lands. China is now Africa's largest trading partner. If you fly into Kenya, China meets you at the airport. A new terminal built by the Chinese is about to open. Another sign of this growing relationship. In just 10 years, China's trade with the continent has gone from $10 billion to over $200 billion. And where is most of the Chinese money going? Infrastructure. Across the continent, Chinese money and Chinese firms are running major infrastructure projects. It is estimated that 30% of all new projects in Africa are the result of Chinese investment. Africa needs new infrastructure to speed up its development. China needs it to enable the free flow of mineral resources it needs from the continent. Here in Kenya, the plans are impressive. This port terminal in Mombasa, completed last year, was built by the Chinese. And the port is at one end of an ambitious $25 billion railway line to be paid for and built by the Chinese, linking the capitals of Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and South Sudan. But as the friendship with China grows, at every stop along the proposed railway line, the West appears to be losing influence.
We need to be able to understand that the age or the era of dictating to small nations or trying to force down specific agendas are gone.
Everybody's lecturing us. You should do this, you should do that, you should do that. But this is my house. I know how to run my house.
One world that is the West, that feels they have the right to dominate, to control, to impose themselves.
Before signing off on these multi-billion-dollar deals, Chinese officials are not demanding, like the West is, that African leaders conform to Western standards of human rights, economic reform, and anti-corruption. In Africa, many see this as a welcome break from the evangelism of Western governments who have been accused of putting undue pressure on them to adopt Western-style democracies. For the first time since the Cold War, African leaders like President Kenyatta can do more than simply criticize the West. They can now look elsewhere for meaningful economic and political support. And China's policy of no strings attached investment contrasts starkly with the tradition of Western conditional aid. As African governments and industry welcome Chinese engagement and African leaders become more vocally critical of Western powers, are we Africans now at the center of a battle for Africa? I spoke to Kenya's top civil servant in the Ministry of Infrastructure. He is a fan of the Chinese way of doing things, and with their support is building thousands of kilometers of new roads and connecting the country like never before. Is it that the Chinese are, respecting the Africans? Arguments that I've heard that, the West comes in as the master and, therefore they don't want to bend, they don't want to learn or embrace the African ways. Is this part of the problem?
Yes, I think I agree with you entirely that the approach is, how do I perceive you? Chinese come and more or less within a few days are equal level with their fellow contractors. I think with an open mind, the Western contractors, again, they can be able to learn something from these Chinese contractors.
It must be exciting for you now. You have choices.
I think what we are really coming out is competition, and in terms of how fast can we be able to deliver a project, how fast can we be able to access to the loan, how fast can we be able to adopt what we call our kind of requirements. So it's up to Western contractors to learn what are these key issues which Chinese are addressing, which probably they are not addressing.
But China is bringing more than its business to Africa. It's bringing its power and influence too. Tribalism has always dominated Kenyan politics. And in December 2007, Kenya exploded. The country split down tribal lines in a fury of violence after a hotly contested presidential election. Over 1,000 people were killed. Hundreds of thousands lost their homes. Next, the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, charged current President Uhuru Kenyatta, leader of Kenya's largest tribe, the Kikuyu, and his deputy William Ruto, leader of Kenya's third largest tribe, the Kalenjin, of being connected to murders and rapes that took place during the violence. Every case since the International Criminal Court was founded in 2002 has been against an African. And now that a sitting president is facing trial, people not just in Kenya but throughout Africa reject the ICC's action and worse, accuse it of Western-backed racism.
But now the process has degenerated into some kind of race hunting.
While President Kenyatta vigorously criticized the ICC and Western powers, China threw its weight behind demands to have the ICC trial suspended.
The Kenyan leaders were democratically elected by the Kenyan people, and their dignity should be fully protected and respected.
Nothing did more to solidify Kenya's growing bond with its eastern partner. Kisumu in western Kenya is where the worst of the tribal violence happened. Bernard's entire family was murdered by a gang from an opposing tribe allegedly mobilized by President Kenyatta. He has been scarred for life by the bonds he sustained.
Hapa ndio kaburi. Alafu walikuja kuvamia sisi kwa nyumba, alafu wakaweka petroli wakisha moto. Watu yangu yote 11 walikufia katika hiyo moto. Nilisikia tu kwa radio ati president ama naibu president ako huko na case, president pia sijui ako na case huko, hata mimi sijui. Hiyo ni jukumu ya serikali ya Kenya na serikali ya huko, wenye wanataka ukweli ya wananchi ipatikane.
I've seen this so many times in my travels throughout my continent. Tribe is so important. It connects us through families and neighbors to land and tradition, but it also divides us. it robs us of leaders capable of representing and uniting whole nations. At its worst, it kills and destroys millions of us. I wanted to ask President Kenyatta if Chinese investment will be used to benefit all tribes in Kenya. Despite many requests, he was not available for an interview. Raila Odinga is the leader of Kenya's second largest tribe, the Luo. And because tribe dominates politics in Kenya, that makes him Kenya's opposition leader as well. He was the losing candidate in the violent election 7 years ago. He thinks many of his countrymen are wrong to criticize the International Criminal Court's action against President Kenyatta.
The charge that the West is targeting individuals is very, very misplaced indeed. Because it's Africa which is taking its people to the ICC.
Do you worry that the Chinese no strings attached money, the way they're doing business, will just strengthen more corrupt leaders?
I still believe that China needs to look into this aspect of governance on the continent. The human rights issues in the countries where they trade, rather than just looking at an economy in terms of its ability to repay the debt which is being advanced by the Chinese government.
It's clear that China's engagement raises serious questions about the future of human rights and efforts to fight corruption. The West's commitment to human rights is negotiable, from Egypt and Israel to Saudi Arabia. But at least human rights are on the agenda. If China, the new economic superpower, is committed to a policy that allows governments like those in Sudan and Angola to crush opposition with no consequences, what will be the future of human freedom here in Africa? There are at least 1 million Chinese living in Africa today. The young Chinese who created China House in Nairobi want to help bridge the gap between Chinese people, the companies they work for, and Kenyans. Huang Hongshang is the group's founder. The West has been very critical about China when it comes to human rights, when it comes to democracy, the way they run their own politics.
A lot of those criticism is not very well received by Chinese, including me. For example, when we talk about human rights, we know human rights including as actually the rights to food, the rights to health, the rights to water, and also the rights to freedom of speech and so on. So when Chinese government actually leave like a huge population of people out of poverty, is actually doing really well in terms of human rights. We would not say like Chinese system is perfect, but we really wish that the West could be more listen to the Chinese opinion, the Chinese perspective, and work with us equally without any presumption that they are right and we are wrong.
Do you feel that there is a sense of West and East actually battling to sell their ideas, their way of life and their philosophy to Africa?
I would say the big difference is like whether people can make their own choice. We Chinese, we believe Western people like should not intervene China because China know what is the best way for China, and China should not intervene Africa because Africa know what is good for Africa. I would say that's the big difference.
This is one of China House's projects, a nationwide competition in collaboration with a major Chinese company that will help train Kenyan technical college students in state-of-the-art machinery.
If you've looked around our institutions, the equipment we have are 30, 40, 50 years old. So we need modern equipment. And China is ready to give us the modern equipment. So this is why we are moving. We are moving with the world. China was where we are 30 years ago. And China has been able to move forward. So benchmarking with China, we believe that Kenya can move very fast.
Ling Chi works for Avic International, the Chinese company that built the new airport terminal and who are sponsoring the project. Why do you think that this relationship between China and Kenya seems to be working, or Africa in general seems to be working so well?
I think for the China and the Kenya, we more feel like brothers. Or let me be strict, we are more equal to each other because we have the same kind of history, we are kind of conquered, and so we truly understand each other. I think there's so many things we can share with our friends from Kenya because not so far ago we are almost the same situation. So if China within decades we can make it. Why can't Kenya? Why can't Africans?
Even as Chinese influence increases, the West has interests that compel it to become more involved here. Westgate Mall, September last year, terrorists killed 67 people. This attack in Nairobi has been followed by numerous more along the coast near Mombasa, striking at the heart of Kenya's lucrative tourist industry. This beach, previously packed with holidaymakers, is strangely quiet. Kenya has become a front line in the war on terror, a hot war being fought by African troops backed by the West. Kenya alone has committed almost 4,000 soldiers to the conflict in Somalia, and while the country is paying a price for its involvement, the politicians here know they can count on continued support from the West, even while they court new business from China.
We all want the same goal. The goals of the current government of Kenya are ones that we totally subscribe to. They are for a more secure Kenya, which defeats the threat, a very real threat of terrorism. We are old partners, and as befits that, we may not always agree on things, but we don't need to do anything other than work together in partnership.
What do you think about the perception that the relationship between Britain and Kenya is in decline because of the strengthening relationship between Kenya and China?
I recognize the perception, but I don't recognize the reality, I think is my main response. We are the largest trading partner outside of East Africa for Kenya. Over 30% of the exports from Kenya go to the European Union. Of the top 10 taxpayers in Kenya, 5 are British companies. The 2 largest private sector employers in Kenya are British companies. More visitors come to Kenya from Britain every year than from any other country. Our relationship is deep, it is historic, it is broad. So the idea somehow that it's diminished, I just don't think faces up to the facts. The idea then that there is some kind of competition with China, I think also doesn't really reflect the reality of the way the world works in the 21st century. This isn't the Cold War. So fundamentally, I think the Chinese investment in Kenya and Chinese investment in Africa is a good thing. It should be welcomed. All of those of us who want to see a more prosperous, more stable Kenya should welcome investment in infrastructure, in roads. It's not a competition. It doesn't need to be a binary choice. This is a multipolar world.
There's no doubt that China is coming, and it's coming like a fast-speed train. But this country, Kenya, like many other African countries, was built with Western systems, Western infrastructure, Western language, and clearly the West is here to stay. But for me, this is looking like a win-win situation for Africa. A win-win situation for Africa, but only if we take advantage of the opportunity. On this journey, it's becoming clearer that the real battle for Africa is not between East and West. It is a battle to control our own destinies that only we Africans can fight. And for some of us, that battle starts in the classroom. The Confucius Institute is a Chinese state-sponsored language and culture school. There are more than 20 of them around Africa. The courses are free. For decades, many of the strongest and brightest Africans have left the continent to chase their dreams in Europe or America. But these young Kenyans have chosen to stay here in Africa, learn Chinese, and embrace the new opportunities from the East. I spoke to Isaac, and Maureen to find out how they felt Kenya and Africa could benefit most from the new relationship they share with their old partners, the West, and their new friends, China.
We need to think about ourselves first in this kind of a situation, because now we see both sides are trying to woo us.
In my opinion, the talk always begins and ends with the leadership. Like in Kenya, there's been a lot of misappropriation of funds. So when, for example, our president signs a pact or a deal with either the West or the East, what matters most is how will his government make sure that the ordinary people benefit to the fullest?
The leadership of the country is what will determine if the grassroots will benefit. First of all, we need to transfer skills. Whether the West or the East builds the roads for us, can we have transfer of skills to the local engineers, local graduates, so that in 5, 10, 20 years, we can do this on our own?
Our worry is, at the end of the day, will we get the independence we so long for?
Will Chinese engagement lead to the transfer of skills and broad economic development, or will it protect corrupt and repressive governments? That is up to us Africans. Bob Marley famously quoted the great Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." For over half a century, this continent has been free from the shackles of colonialism, but we still haven't freed ourselves from tribalism and corruption. The national politicians who run this country's major tribal parties have done nothing for these people. The Ojek tribe in western Kenya is too small to have powerful friends. They have lived in the Mao forest for centuries, but today they are struggling to survive. The forests cut down and their land taken away by generations of corrupt politicians.
Omukondoi kemira ko kikoek mokorae ile ini sarwo kolenjin wis inyon koron iwe ai si inyon koron ot kobet ngalechu ka itebi kabilana.
How long will it be before our governments listen to the concerns of minority tribes like the Ojek? Gitu Wakahengeri is a veteran of the Mau Mau rebellion and spent over 7 years detained by the British.
We thought by today, 50 years of independence, we are not inviting Chinese to come and build a standard railway line. We would do it. Therefore, we say those we handed over the independence that we recovered have failed us. And this is why we keep on asking them, can you revisit your commitment to leadership? That vision of self-reliance is not there. I have not read or heard anywhere in Africa that people are sacrificing enough for their own country, because they have learned that bribery way. And unless that is reversed, then we cannot have a hope. We are now leading to hopelessness.
China gives Kenya and countries all over Africa the chance to develop and grow faster whilst keeping relations with all sides. But the overbearing influence of foreign powers is still a deep and legitimate concern. We in Africa have been blessed with our precious minerals and natural resources. But the most valuable and scarce resource on this continent is good government, because that's what the real battle for Africa is all about. Governments free from corruption, bringing us true independence, and the continent free at last from the overbearing influence of foreign powers. Next week, in part 2 of the Battle for Africa, I speak to the presidents of Ghana and Botswana as I go in search of good governance on the continent.